Welcome to Wellsprings of Faith. My name is Father Jürgen Liias. I am a Roman Catholic priest serving at the Catholic Church, St. Patrick's in Stoneham, a neighboring community to Melrose. I live here in Melrose, and we've been offering up this program, Wellsprings of Faith, for almost about 30 years. And it's good to be with you again. The focus of our program is a person's faith, their journey of faith, and the fruit of that faith in our community and in our world. It's a wonderful joy to bring back to our program a dear, dear old friend who was here many years ago and who has recently retired, and I thought it'd be a wonderful opportunity to have him come and reflect on his life and ministry as a Christian pastor. His name is the Reverend Dr. Ray Pendleton. He's worn many hats, which we'll be talking about, but most recently, and he retired as a Professor of Pastoral Theology at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary up in the North Shore. Welcome.
Thank you.
Happy retirement. You retired for 3 days. How's it going?
Well, retirement is difficult.
Are you bored already?
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad we have this opportunity to fill a day for you.
Yeah.
Although I think in the ministry and in the service of Christ, there's no such thing as retirement.
Well, no, I'm still ministering to some of our people who have some needs. Person that you met with last week.
Yes.
And then I'm ministering to a woman that I've known for a long time who's struggling with cancer.
Oh, yes.
So I'll go and pray for her and anoint her this week.
This week, yeah.
So it really never stops.
No, it never ends. It never ends. And even when we're debilitated, I say we always have the ministry of intercession and prayer. And
well, that's when you get old. You have a long intercessory
long
list.
intercessory list. So, but it's a great. Well, let's go not to the end of your ministry, but to the beginning, and more importantly, the beginning of your relationship to Jesus and your Savior. Talk a little bit about how you came to faith.
Well, I grew up in a wonderful family. My parents were both believers. I'm the oldest of 6 children.
Even though they weren't Catholic, 6 kids.
6 kids, yeah. And I began my education in a little one-room schoolhouse in Owl's Head, Maine.
Owl's Head.
8 grades in one room.
Wow.
One teacher, Miss Grover.
Miss Grover, you remember her.
They've taken down that schoolhouse. I thought they'd keep it as a memorial to me, but no.
If not to you, to her, right?
Yeah, at least.
Yeah.
In any case, then we moved into town. We belonged to First Baptist Church in Rockland. I grew up there, a wonderful church, preaching the gospel, and that's where I came to faith there. Well, they used to give invitations at the end of the service, and I went forward many times. My father finally said to me, look, you don't need to do it again. You've done it once. So, but that was a wonderful, nurturing church.
And when were you baptized? And now in the Baptist tradition.
I was baptized there as a Baptist.
How old were you when you were baptized?
I was 13.
13,
yeah. We had a long period of instruction before that.
Yeah, I mean, the Baptist tradition preaches what's called believer's baptism.
Yes.
So you need to be able to announce your faith and proclaim it and know it before you are baptized. Yeah.
It's a wonderful, wonderful thing.
Right.
Our pastor was really the dean of pastors, Dr. J. Towles McDonald. He used to wear his morning coat and all of that, which is an old thing.
Yeah.
But for him, the communion was a very important thing. The communion table is a special place set aside just on the left of the pulpit platform. And that was consumed the whole service when we had communion.
Now that's somewhat unusual in that tradition. It is unusual. Right.
Usually, I've been in some terrible places when I visited.
Yeah.
I was one place that was just dreadful. It was in Florida, so it's a big state. But we went to the service, and it was not bad. And then he said, now we're going to have communion. And so he announced the introduction to communion, and then he pronounced the blessing.
And that was communion.
Well, what's going on? When we left, they gave us these little packets, these hermetically sealed things, and I thought, what a dreadful experience.
Isn't it ironic, though, in these days of COVID, a lot of churches are back to that, but that was way ahead.
During COVID in the beginning, but
right.
That was a little different.
I know, and the strange, a whole different, and well, we'll get back, because I know in your journey you become deeply committed, well, you started there, it sounds like, to the sacramental dimension of the
Yes, well,
Christian
I
faith.
used to, I was a boy singer, always been a singer until 90-year-old tenors are not. But, you know, it's, so I used to travel with him. He was the dean of the preachers. He'd build these little churches, and I would go along to sing. And
Oh, how nice.
so that was,
You were the choir, huh?
I was the choir.
That's
Well,
interesting, because my childhood was, I was in a boys' choir, but I was the lead soprano.
Well, I was a boy soprano,
Yeah.
became a tenor, and then I studied voice for a while. So that was my high school. I was a terrible student because I had great fun. I didn't pay attention. I tell you one vignette. When I was in high school, I was almost always in trouble. I spent a lot of time. I just had a great time, but I misbehaved a lot, I think. I know. So we were changing principals. And Mr. Blaisdell was retiring, and Mr. Clooney was coming in. And I thought, well, you know, this would be a time for the school to take a break. So I said to the high school, let's organize a parade and so I said, let's get down, we make some posters and we'll go down through Main Street saying, we want Joe or we won't go. We just walked out and did this. Well, I was leading this. And
This was sort of a fun protest for the new,
Oh, yeah.
to welcome the new thing? You
welcome
want the old
new
one
man,
back? Oh.
say goodbye to the old one.
Oh.
But I didn't say anything. It came out in the paper the next day. My father said, what have you done? He said, I don't want you to ever do that again. He was a strict disciplinarian, so it was interesting. So I had that good
So
time.
where'd you get this mischievous little
spirit?
spirit?
I don't know. You know, it's just, I don't know where from, but I always had it. And so, yeah, so I had a great time. And I did well because I didn't have to study, but I didn't behave well. And yeah, my math teacher used to rap me on the wrist and say, now, Raymond.
Now, how did you relate your mischievous school life to your faith and church life?
Well, that was kind of separate somewhere. And we had a very active youth group. I used to go to camp in the summers. And so one of my counselors, we talked about this. He said, you know, Ray, you need to look at the scriptures to see how your faith is confirmed. So they were very helpful. Potato farmer from Mars Hill, Maine, but he was a wonderful guy, and Mr. Keegan, and I still remember
He taught
that.
you the Bible.
Yeah, it was very good.
Potato farmer.
Potato farmer, yeah.
That's great. That's great.
So my mother always wanted me to be a minister, and I was rebellious, and whatever she wanted, I didn't want. So
Were there any clergy in the family tree?
No.
No.
Well, yes, in a distant family
Right,
tree.
right,
Yeah. We all our family comes from a little island off the coast of Maine called Islesboro.
Oh, yes, I've heard of that.
Yeah. Well, there's a Pendleton General Store and a Pendleton Library and a
Interesting.
Pendleton Yacht Yard.
And how'd they wind up there? What's the history of
I
your
don't know.
family?
Yes, I have a whole history. Goes back
Yeah.
to 1790.
Wow.
So yeah.
And that's a pretty hard, we think of it as romantic living on an island, but that's a pretty harsh life.
Yeah.
An island off the
But
coast.
it's only 21 miles long, so there's not much to do with it.
Yeah, yeah.
Now it's
And it's pretty harsh winters, my
yes.
gosh.
Well, on the coast. Yeah. So I grew up in a little fishing village.
Yeah.
And when I graduated from high school, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but I thought I would go and study with one of the men who was a voice teacher. So I went to Providence Bible Institute in Rhode Island and studied there. And then when I left there, I traveled with an evangelist. He was sort of an evangelist, Paul Gerard Jackson. He had these dramatic vignettes with lights and scenery and all of this called Men Who Met the Master. They were monologues. He's really a gifted actor.
right.
And so I traveled with him to set up the stuff, and he's a song leader, and do the interviews that he didn't want to do and all of that. So we traveled all over the
Were
West
those
Coast.
ever recorded or written down? Those?
No, I don't think it's a shame because they were
Yeah,
very,
they're probably
very good.
brilliant, yeah.
And then I went, and that's when I was after Bible school. So the man who traveled with him before said, I tried to get a hold of you because he'll work you, but he won't pay you anything. So, which is true. But but I made a commitment, so I stayed with him.
Yeah.
And that was a tough journey. But I felt, well, that was my father. If you made a commitment, follow through with it.
Yeah.
If it's difficult, stay with it. So I did. Yeah. So, and then I came home. And
How old are you now at this point?
Oh, probably, what, 21?
21. Okay.
21, yeah. So maybe 20, only
Yeah,
20, I
yeah.
think. I graduated from school early.
Yeah.
So
Was the Bible college a 2-year school?
yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's good training, great training. But I didn't want it. So the Korean War came up, and I thought, well, I think I'll just enlist. So I went into the Air Force, and I was taught. I didn't like the military. After all, I discovered that I'm not a lot of silly rules that didn't make sense. But because I had a degree, I got teaching basic training in the place where I did basic training. Teaching recruits, some of who could not even read, and it was. And so I was there for a while. They gave me a lot of honors, but an Airman's Medal, and then they transferred me to Luke Air Force Base in Arizona, and my present wife Jan, we grew up together in the same church. I've known her for all my life. I say, when people don't always listen carefully, we slept together before we could walk. Anyway, it's true.
Yeah.
But we were in the same nursery in church.
Oh my gosh.
She's only a few weeks older than I
Wow.
am. So we were engaged, and I came home on my way to I was in Phoenix. She was going to transfer to there. And I came home to get married, and then I got she worked for a telephone company. She's transferred to the one in Phoenix, but then the military had a different idea. They sent me to Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. Oh my! So I went down there after a honeymoon. I was down there for 6 months.
Without her?
Without her.
Was she in Arizona?
Well,
Oh,
she knew that when I was told me to talk about. That was a tough time for me,
Yeah.
but I didn't want to be a captain. I stayed as an airman because I didn't want to be an officer.
Yeah.
I thought, I made a 4-year commitment. I'll be fine. So we're in Fort Walton Beach, Florida, which was an Eglin Air Force Base, and I was working at the chapel. I was directing the choir at the chapel, base chapel. We had an interesting chaplain, Chaplain Cruz. I remember him. He was a Unitarian. He said, "Well, I don't really have a title." So, a little group in church from Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, invited someone for a chaplain to come and preach. Well, he said I went and preached, and he came back. I was putting away the music. He said, "Ray," he said, "I've just been in town." He said, "They're your kind of people. They believe in Bible and in Jesus and all that stuff." So he said, I know you went to school." He said, "I gave him your name." I said, "Well, I've been running away from the ministry forever. I don't want to." So I said, "Well, if they call me, I can go once."
Yeah.
So they said, "Would you come once?" And so I did, and I preached. They said, "Oh, good. Would you come back next week?" So I went back the next week, and that became the pattern.
That was the
I went
beginning.
back every week after that. And the military likes good publicity. And so they publicized this. Airman preaches in town.
Oh.
Well, it was an interesting kind of thing. So the general called me in. He said, "Airman," I thought, "Well, what kind of trouble am I in now? Maybe I've been too involved in the city." He said, "We're very pleased with what you've done. Brings good name to the Air Force." He said, "How much longer do you have to serve?" And I said, "Oh, I got another 7 months to serve." He said, "Does your church want you to come full time?" And I said, "Actually, they do, but I've got 7 more months." So he said, "Well, I can let you out early." And I said, "You can?" He said, "I'm a general. I can let you out." So that's what happened. I went
Wow.
served this little Christian church, Disciples of Christ, there in Fort Walton Beach. Now, can you imagine? They ordained me, and and I served that church. It was a military church, wonderful church. Had a wonderful lot of experiences there, but would take too long to tell. And then the district.
But that was your first ordination. I remember I was, of course, present last week at your farewell party at the Anglican Church where I used to be the pastor.
Yeah.
And well, you said you've had 5 different ordinations, so right? Was
Well,
it?
no, 5
4?
different churches.
Churches,
yeah.
right. So that was your first.
That was my first.
Disciples of Christ.
I've only had 2 ordinations. One.
Now they have a strong emphasis upon communion too, don't
Oh
they?
yeah. It was the old the way.
So it's like a thread in your ministry. It sounds
Well,
like.
disciples got started because they were Presbyterians. They came for communion, but they didn't have a token. In order to come to communion, you had to have a token.
Oh.
And he was so annoyed with that.
Was that Campbell? Was that his name?
Yeah, Campbell.
Campbellites.
Yeah, it was, and he started the Christian Church as Disciples of Christ.
Yeah.
But it's very much a part of the whole service.
Right.
It's the
Every
word,
week, right?
Word and sacrament every week.
Yeah.
So
So that too is very unusual in the Protestant world.
yeah. So and then they wanted me to go to Auburn University to be the chaplain to their little disciple student center there.
Ah.
So I said, well, okay. And I had the GI Bill, and I thought, I don't really know anything about psychology, and so I took an undergraduate degree in psychology and a master's degree
At
in
Auburn.
psychology while I was there at the church.
Oh,
That was fine with them. And so I had a good ministry there, although it was a really tough time, because this was the peak of the civil rights crisis.
Oh, in the South.
Yeah, in the South. And it was a really difficult time. Our parsonage was across the street from what was called the Quarter. This is where poor black people lived. The tar paper shacks, no electricity, no plumbing, just a central fountain in the middle of the thing. So the women went out to be domestic work, and we had a wonderful woman who come. And I said to Maddie, I said, I feel really bad having you to work. She said, oh, don't feel bad for me. You pay me more than anybody else. So, so she was wonderful, because we had our first daughter was born there, and so she used to take little Janet around in the business. But there was a fire in one of the women had gone out to work and apparently left a kerosene, and the children knocked it over and they were incinerated.
Oh my God.
It was awful. So I was just so horrified at that. But anyway, so we got a group together, the pastors got a group together, and we built a fireproof child care center.
Oh.
Yeah, that was a good time.
Yeah.
But it was really tough.
Yeah.
I don't want to burden you with a lot of stories, but I got to know the principal of the black school. And we used to find a place to play tennis because we couldn't really be together. And then he was doing some graduate work, and I would take books from the library and give them to him. So we'd come back from playing tennis, and we were sitting on the deck of of my house having tea, which is a good thing there. And and we did that afterward always. But so Mr. Spencer, the chairman of the school committee, I name his name because he should be ashamed, and he said to Bob Blake, who was Bob Black rather, who was the principal of the school. He said, "Come here, boy." That was well, that's the way it was.
Yeah, that's the way they talk.
And so Bob came back and he said, "Bray, I got to go." I said, "What did he say to you?" He said, "He told me if I ever see you here again, you're going to be fired and you'll never get a job again."
Wow.
So
Just sitting having tea in your porch.
yeah. Well, these
Yeah, that was
rednecks.
the segregated
It
South.
was awful. That was a whole thing of the South.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, I served that church there, and then I got thinking, I was counseling a lot of students, and I thought, well, I have some education, but not enough.
What drew you to psychology in the first place? I know that's been a big
Well,
part of your
I
life
think probably
too,
if I look back at my history, my mother had some severe emotional problems, and I know now that it was a kind of period of psychosis for several years when I was, say, between 5 and 13. My father's a rock. He brought us through all of that because there were 6 of us altogether, but my sister and I, and then after that she recovered. They had 4 more children. But that, I think, probably, if I look back at my history unconsciously. I think that's probably what drew me to psychology.
It's interesting. I believe this, correct me if I'm wrong, but, you know, particularly in the sort of more conservative Protestant world, where we would call in those days the fundamentalist world, correct? There would be a lot of kind of wariness and hostility of things like psychology.
Psychology,
you know,
But I think, you know,
worldly thinking.
Things changed a bit.
Yeah.
So I said, well, I think I'll apply, see what happens. So I applied to UMass as a safety school because they accepted a lot of people. And I had stopped at Boston University to talk to the chairman of the department when I was visiting, going up to Maine, where we were visiting our parents. And so when I said, well, it's a wonderful program there, but they only accepted 13 students.
Oh.
And they had like 700 applicants, 650 applicants every year. And I said, I'll never get in there. So but I applied anyway to both places. My safety school wouldn't take me. And I got a call from, so I got a letter of acceptance from Boston University. I said, well, it really can't be as difficult to get in as he said. So I didn't do anything with it. And pretty soon, Chester Bennett, chairman of the department, called me and said, Mr. Pendleton, are you planning to come or not? We have a long waiting list. And I said, well, he said, I need to know within a week. I said, okay, I'll pray for it. He said, what? So anyway, that was it. And so I was there, and that's where I did my PhD.
Okay,
at the Boston University.
In psychology.
In clinical psychology.
Wow.
So that's a long educational story. But,
yes.
While I was in school, we lived in Everett, and the pastor of the Baptist church there had been in our home church. And so he said, well, so we were worshiping there. And he said, well, we need a choir director. So I served as choir director and
still continuing your music career.
Yeah,
so you've got
a
music career, a pastoral career, and now a psychological career.
So it was an interesting mix of things.
Yeah.
So that's the educational experience. And so while we were there, then we moved to Peabody, where we're moving from now. We've been there for 56 years,
wow,
57 years.
Wow.
My youngest daughter was born there. And that's an incredible story, if you don't mind. Sharon she and her twin brother was stillborn.
Oh.
We didn't know there were twins. So, and she weighed 2 pounds and 9 ounces.
In those days, that must have been.
And that long time ago.
Yeah, the medical.
I mean, I could hold her in one hand.
My gosh.
So, so the liver builds up a lot of bilirubin, and she was very cyanotic and just all dark.
Yeah.
And they took her to Children's Hospital in Isolette, and I followed in with her. Jen was at home, and I said, because she was shocked by what had happened, and so I remember Mr. Asher, Dr. Asher, he was an intern at Children's Hospital. He said, well, Mr. Pendleton, he said, she's so cyanotic, we have to do a blood exchange, but she's so little, we can't do what we call a femoral cut down, because if the umbilical stamp is at all viable, I can do a blood exchange with a little syringe. And he did that.
Wow.
And she was in the hospital she was supposed to be born in October. She was born in August.
Wow.
Yeah, so very early.
It was premature as
and he
well.
said, well, even if she survives, she'll have severe brain damage. So I thought, well, we're thankful we have her. So we stopped going to visit because in the old days, they had them in Isolette, and you couldn't touch them.
No.
Now touching is really a key kind of thing because they thrive. So after a while, we brought her home in about the time she would have been born in October. And she was still a little thing, just incredibly difficult, but it was a great joy. And I have 2 daughters. My oldest daughter was born in Alabama, in Opelika, and Sharon. 2 wonderful daughters.
So no other children, the 2 of them? Yeah. And your deceased son, you said, is stillborn.
Yeah. And and so we have a wonderful family. Wow. My youngest daughter is a social worker. She's married to a pastor. He's executive pastor for the Convergent International in New England. So they live near this place where we're moving when we retire.
In Connecticut, I know.
Yeah, in Connecticut.
So you went from there, your PhD in psychology, what you do next in your career? Did you
Well,
start practicing as a psychologist?
Yeah, psychology. I was a clinical psychologist. I had a practice, and then I went to teach for 10 years at Salem State University.
Oh.
Yeah, in psychology. And then my good friend, who was at George Endworth, who was teaching pastoral counseling at the seminary.
Yes, I remember
I'd gotten to know
George
him through
Endworth,
some music
yeah.
programs I'd done with his wife. And he said, we're having some problems at the seminary. Seminary had problems. Faculty were having some internal conflicts. Conflicts among Christians are really more interesting sometimes.
Don't I know it?
Yeah, so that's what happened there. And so I came and met with them, and I did some group work with the faculty. And he said, you know...
So you first came basically as a consultant.
I came as a consultant.
To help deal with their internal problems.
So, and then he said, you know, I need some help with pastoral counseling, because in those days we had this landslide of people coming into ministry.
Yes.
So the classes were big. And I said,
This
well,
is
you
in
know...
the 70s now we're talking
Yeah,
about mostly?
yeah.
Yeah, that's when I think I first connected with you, not too long after
so
that.
and so I said, well, so what happened is that he said, well, could you come back and teach? And I said, well, you know, I said, I don't know if it's the right thing. He said, can you take, so they gave me a year's leave of absence at Salem University, so I could go there and teach for a year.
Yeah.
No, I loved it. It was wonderful. I sort of found the place where I wanted to be. But I had...
At Salem, you weren't teaching. You were doing counseling.
No, I was teaching.
Oh, you were
I was teaching counseling.
Teaching counseling.
And
Okay.
so basically...
So you were teaching already. So
Yeah.
in the field.
Well, I started teaching in Alabama when I was still there,
Yeah,
so
okay.
too. And so...
But you also had a practice of
yeah,
private practice as well.
very busy private practice.
Yeah.
And
You've
so,
maintained that all these years.
yeah, I have, yeah. So it was, in fact, I just, I retired from that in 2000 because this managed care, I call it mangled care, but yeah, it was too much paperwork.
Yeah, yeah.
And I didn't think there was any sense of confidentiality.
Oh,
So I thought we
right,
should stop.
right.
And so I did. But I stayed then the seminary, I need to finish that story. Seminary said, can you come full time? I said, well, I don't know. Because I owe the state now a year. So, a wonderful man, Jim, a good Catholic, and he came to visit me at the seminary. And he said, oh, this is a wonderful place. You enjoy it here? And I said, oh, I love it here. They'd like me to come, but you know, I owe the state another year. He said, again, well, I can forgive that.
Oh.
And I said, you can? He said, well, yes, I'm the dean. I can do that. So
So
we
that
did
was the beginning of that switch. Look at, believe it or not, we're almost out of time. Would you mind if we did another show and picked you up? You practically, we haven't got through a third of your life yet, I don't think. Never mind.
Yeah, no, that's
yeah.
fine. If you can tolerate another show.
So just to kind of finish off this before we end, and then we'll continue on in our next program. So you went from teaching at a secular school to now you were invited to teach psychology, counseling, at a seminary.
And yet Gordon Conwell Seminary.
Right. And that was in the mid to late 70s?
I started there in 1972.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I think I sort of showed up around there in the 70s. I started having Gordon Conwell students. Because that'll be the next set we're going to talk about.
All right.
Is the incredible work you did in what Gordon Conwell calls mentored ministries. I think where I went to seminary, Episcopal Seminary, they call it field education, but it's the same thing. Students heading out to work in churches to see if all their, somebody said about theological, you can be so heavenly minded, you're no earthly good, right?
Yeah, that could be.
So helping them train in that practical sense. So well, let's thank you for this. First, we're about 30 years into your life, aren't we? Or 35 maybe. Thank you for that wonderful, rich childhood. Now we'll pick it up in a few minutes and head on to the rest of your life. Thank you for joining us for part one of this interview with Father Dr. Ray Pendleton. He is presently an Episcopal priest, an Anglican priest. We'll get to that a little later, and recently retired as Professor of Pastoral Theology and mentored ministry at Gordon Conwell Seminary. So please join us again.